Hello and welcome to University Television Presents. My name is Ashley Cox and today I am joined by an Associate History Professor, Lynn Lubamersky. How are you doing, Lynn?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We truly appreciate it. So, Lynn, can you actually tell us a bit about your educational background?
I studied Russian history at University of California, Berkeley for my undergrad degree, and then I went on to graduate study for my master's degree and PhD at Indiana University.
Awesome. Go Hoosiers. So what are some of the courses that you teach here on campus?
I mostly teach the history of Europe from 1648 to the present, but the electives that I teach are things in my specialization: the history of the family, the history of women in Europe, the Holocaust, and then other classes as they come up.
Awesome. Do you have a particular favorite that you enjoy teaching the most, or do you all enjoy them all?
I tend to just enjoy the one that I'm teaching at a given time. Like right now, we're doing a really interesting family history class about mapping households of the past.
Oh, wow.
So that's a lot of fun. And I'm a finalist for a Fulbright scholarship, and so I wanted to do it here in Boise before I did it in Lithuania. We're going to do mapping the households of the past, Jewish households, Polish households, the households of the people of the past in Vilnius, Lithuania.
That is awesome. That is so cool.
I want to hear, but I guess they're pretty busy in Lithuania right now. They've got other things on their plate.
Yes. So what's some of the research that you've conducted and that you've been able to expose and tell people about?
Well, my main focus for my published research is the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and I sent you a map, but most people kind of gloss over when they hear that term. They don't know what it is, because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a really large state encompassing the current-day Poland, current-day Lithuania, all the way almost down to the Black Sea. And my specialization is about how families operated within the political system.
Wow. Especially
women in the political system.
All of these classes that you teach coming into one. That's awesome. So there's a lot going on in Ukraine, and we've previously talked about how you know a lot about the Ukraine, so this is great. Can you please educate us on the current, what's happening over there in the Ukraine with Russia, like what's going on?
Okay. Well, it's in 1991 the Soviet Union broke apart, and Ukraine sort of stayed closely connected. It didn't join the European Union. It didn't join NATO. But its Prime Minister, Viktor Yanukovych, wanted to. He was elected in order to sign something called the Accession Treaty to the European Union. So each country goes into the European Union with a set of conditions. So Denmark would go in a different set of conditions than Poland would. And he had agreed to sign those conditions. And at the time, the president of the European Union was also the president of Lithuania. Her name is Dalia Grybauskaitė. And so they had the meeting in Vilnius, but the Ukrainian prime minister didn't sign. And so the people started to gather in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, at the Maidan Square, which I think also is called the Plac Europejski. Like in the Polish time period, it was called the European Plaza. And so they symbolically chose this place because they want to be in Europe. They want to be a part of Europe. They don't want to be disconnected from Europe, because they really were connected to Europe for many, many years. For centuries, part of Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so, therefore, the people of Ukraine, at least Western Ukraine, really feel like they deserve the chance to have a better government, have a more democratic government, and to be a part of Europe. And so the demonstrations started in Maidan, and they were countered by force, and so they became very violent, especially in November, and they came to a head with, I don't really know when you can say they came to a head, and they're certainly not finished, so it's an ongoing situation. But I think that these two different opinions about the future of the country were bound to come to a head at some point. And I don't know that it's only going to be a negative thing if it turns into a really violent conflict. But right now, it has not been thus far that violent.
So was that near like the Cold War time period, did that have anything to do with what's happening now? Like, is there intersection between that?
Well, I'm a historian, so I tend to see things along a longer view. Like right now we're looking at Russia's annexation of Crimea. And so I think that was the subject that you wanted me to talk about for this interview. And I think that sometimes people in the West viewed Russia from 1991 to 2013 as a country that was happy with the situation the way that it was. But we now know, after reading Vladimir Putin's speech on the annexation of Crimea, that wasn't the case at all, that there's a certain critical mass of people in Russia that were not happy with the breakup of the Soviet Union and viewed it as a tragedy, quote unquote, quote, a tragedy. Putin himself said that. And so he wants to rebuild. I don't think he just wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. He really wants to reassert Russia's position in the world according to his view, and to sort of rebuild a great Russian empire. So if people watch the Olympic ceremonies, for example, that was the official view of Russia's past. And so it was a great past, and Russia had a more important position in the world than it has now, and so it wants to get that position back.
Yeah, so as we talked about, and you mentioned Crimea, can you explain some of the history of that area?
Well, it's very complex, but just to boil it down, Crimea, and again, if you take a look at the map, one of the things that Putin and Russian nationalists insist, they say Crimea has always been a part of Ukraine, or excuse me, of Russia. But that is completely incorrect. I mean, Crimea has not been a part of Russia for very long. Really, it was only in 1783 that Catherine, the so-called Great, gained that territory. It happened. One of the reasons why I think I can talk about this is because the same situation happened in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as happened in Crimea. Slowly but surely, Russia asserted that there were Russian minority groups in a given state that were being persecuted, that were in danger. And so Russia asserts its right to go in and save the co-nationals. But really, for longer than the Crimea was associated with Russia, it was the Khanate of Crimea. It had its own independent existence, and it paid tribute to the Ottoman Empire, to what now is called Turkey, but then it was the Ottoman Empire. So the people there are ethnically different from Russians, and had an independent existence for centuries.
So earlier you mentioned the Vladimir Putin, and some could compare his actions to Adolf Hitler from the World Wars. Do you think we should be afraid of Putin, whether his leadership style or what's happening over there in Russia, or do his actions resemble that, do you think?
I think that when people say someone is like Hitler, that always puts them into a special category. But for historians, we can see parallels between the actions of Putin and the actions of Hitler. And I think the main parallel is that you have this fictitious state of being where your country was great in the past, that you want to, so your society has had a great deal of power, and then that power is diminished. So that happened with the Germans as a result of World War I. And so the German people didn't want to hear that they were in this lesser position. They wanted the greatness that they had had previously. And also to state that the people that you need to protect who are no longer in your state, so the Germans, wherever they may be, Hitler said, need to be protected. So the Germans, whether they were in the Volga River in the Soviet Union, or whether they were in Gdańsk or Danzig in Poland, they all deserved this protection. And so it's in that way, Putin could be seen as having a similar dialogue. But of course, Putin doesn't have campaigns of mass murder and genocide such as Hitler had.
Yes.
But of course, those were not publicized.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the insight. That's actually interesting to hear that you just see parallels and not necessarily similarities, put them in the same category. So that's nice to see. So based on historical evidence, do you think that Putin can reclaim the glory of the Soviet Union? Do you think he's on the right track of doing it or going about it the right way, coming from a historical standpoint, obviously?
Well, you know, there has been some really good reporting on this. It's difficult in a society where journalists are under threat, like Russia, to conduct real public opinion research. And so I've seen some interesting interviews that show that the bulk of the Russian people support the annexation of Crimea because they have vacationed down there forever, and they view the achievements of having a Black Sea port as extremely important, and so they support that. But on the other hand, I saw in the same interview that they also support the sanctions that the United States has placed against the oligarchs. So we sanctioned financially the most wealthy and powerful people in Russia, and they support that also. So I think that Putin is playing a difficult game because he wants to regain territory. But I believe that just as the Russian people stopped supporting the Russian involvement in Afghanistan because of the terrible price that they had to pay, so they would also back away from the conquest of Ukraine if the Ukrainian people began to fight. And it's since I'm a historian, I really can't tell you what I would not predict the future, and I don't think that I very much hope that Russia doesn't wish to reconstitute the Russian Empire, because I want to be there next year in Lithuania. And if he tries to take it over, no, just joking, of course. But I mean, I hope that Russia wouldn't want to go to war with NATO against NATO to reconstitute the Russian Empire, because those Baltic republics are members of NATO, but it's hard to predict the future. And I think sometimes it's hard to know the opinion of people when you don't have a free society, when you don't have free media. People have their Twitter accounts, people have their blogs and their Facebook feeds, but we don't really know as much as we should about what's happening now in Ukraine, in Crimea, and in Russia.
Do you think, are there anything that other countries can do to help prevent what's going on? Can other countries help out? Do you think it's a good idea that they get involved, or just let it be for them to handle it over there?
Yeah, I think that it's been really interesting to see how soft diplomacy and economic sanctions can work. I mean, one of the first things that happened after the annexation of Crimea was that Visa and MasterCard froze the credit cards of people in Russia. So that was a pain. That was a pain in their pocketbook. So it showed everyone, that this will be a problem. I'm not going to be able to vacation on the Adriatic coast. I'm not going to be able to have my flat in New York. Actually, I saw a really interesting article about how the real estate market of New York has already dropped because Russian oligarchs are no longer commanding the same sort of resources that they had. So I think that if the West wishes to make it very financially painful for Putin to carry out his plan, that will be successful. But ultimately, the West did not predict Putin's actions in Crimea. And there are more than 50,000 troops on the ground, right at the border of eastern Ukraine. And there are violent activities taking place in cities in eastern Ukraine right now. So I think that our intelligence didn't prepare us well for this. But I hope that economic activity will put an end to this. Economic sanctions and economic pain that could be inflicted by the West might put an end to this.
Can you elaborate a little more about why Crimea is so important economically, and things maybe in the past that have happened that are affecting what's going on right now? Just, I know it's not like your specialty, but can you
Well, I
elaborate a
think
little
some people have likened Crimea to San Diego. It's where a lot of retired military from Russia went to retire. And so they constitute perhaps an inordinate percentage of the population, and they're very conservative. And secondly, people used to vacation there, so it's sort of like the Russian Disneyland. And they began vacationing there in the 19th century. So you have great Russian poets writing poetry about Sebastopol. Like the place that I grew up in, Northern California, has a town called Sebastopol that was founded by emigre Russian people. So for them, it has a very sentimental place in their mind. And also, logistically and strategically speaking, it's the seat of the Black Fleet. And so even though global warming has made it so that the Arctic Circle can be just as important maybe for Russian strategic interests, they traditionally, were very happy when they secured that port. And so they were not going to let it go. And I feel for the Crimean Tatars, because certainly they don't want to, they were very happy to be in a Ukrainian state, probably not so much in Russia.
Yeah. So in your professional opinion, what is the best case scenario and the worst case scenario for Crimea in Russia?
Well, the best case scenario is if the incursion stops now, if it stops where it is. I think I couldn't predict the worst case scenario, but it just depends upon how you look at what has happened. Like I've read a lot of German scholars and German politicians talking about this, and for them, the worst case has already happened right now, because what happened was Putin revised the post-World War II borders of Europe. And certainly when Germany reunified, everyone at the table said, we're not going to revise the post-World War II boundaries of Europe, because of course they're unjust. They were made politically and they were made by the military, by Stalin's advance. And there are many places that shouldn't be in the state that they are in, but nobody was going to change that. And so Putin changed that. And so now you've changed all the rules of the game, of the post-World War II game. And so so that has happened, and that was a radical thing. And so I think the worst case scenario is an open conflict between Russia and NATO, but I hope that will not happen.
Yeah. So with all of these changing in lines, do you see this as possibly becoming a really big problem, like almost like another world war, as somebody would call it, or just kind of whatever?
Well, I think you'd have to consult the poli-sci people on that, but I mean, I think that we cannot predict what will happen if the Russian army begins to go into Ukraine. And I just don't know. I mean, I think Putin is gambling, and right now at this point where we are, in April of 2014, his gamble has paid off because he's suffered no real harm. But I think that he must be wondering whether it's intelligent to be pursuing this line.
Has this happened with Russia before, where they've tried to do this to another country, or is this kind of a new thing with Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I'm a scholar of the early modern period, and so what's happening now is exactly what happened at the end of the 18th century. Russia was reasserting itself. Russia saw its co-nationals in a different country. Russia said it had to intercede to protect them. Russia interceded by taking them over. And so what Putin is doing now is just what Russian imperialists have done many, many times.
So with going back to what you like to study in family and the patterns of that, in the Ukraine, how is this going to affect that, do you think?
How is it going to affect?
Like all the families and their patterns and stuff that you're studying.
Well, it's very interesting because right now people can move very easily between Russia and Ukraine. Like I was just reading a very interesting book about Pussy Riot. You might have heard of Pussy Riot before. And when the Russian government was trying to capture them, they fled to Ukraine because it was much, much freer there and they could move about more easily. So now the boundaries between Russia and Ukraine are fluid. You don't need a visa. So, and there are people who live on both sides of the border. But I would say that the Ukrainian government has to get a better defense, and it has to get a stronger border if it wants to continue to exist, because people, Russian people are being paid to participate in these pro-Russian demonstrations. And so if if Ukraine wants to assert its sovereignty as a nation, it has to fortify its border, and that will probably separate people. I don't know, it's interesting to contemplate where the border is in Europe, and there is no border between Europe and Asia. There is no real border. And so Russia wants to create a new Eurasian Union where it will be the center. And of course, people in the West want to fortify the European Union and to make a stronger set of principles that protect people who want to be part of that, like the Ukrainians.
Wow, that is so much going on over there. It's just a lot of mingling and all that. Is there anything in particular you wanted to talk about dealing with the maps that you've brought in, or anything else that we didn't cover that you'd like to discuss?
Well, no, I don't know. I just put those maps out there so you could see what the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is. Maybe if I were going to make my historian's argument, sometimes when Russians are talking about this, they say that Ukraine has always been a part of Russia, but it hasn't really. Ukraine they are a different people, they speak a different language, they have a different culture, and they have as much ties to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, for example, as they do to Russia. I'm a historian, and I've read documents in something that they call, we call it Lithuanian Chancery language, and they call it Old Russian. So this place is an area, Ukraine means on the edge or on the border. It's on the border of Russia, but it's also on the border of Europe. And so I think that people should be allowed their own choice in where they want to be, if they want to be in Russia or if they want to be in the West. And I think the people of Ukraine have chosen, and I hope that we will support them in their desire to be part of the West.
Awesome. One last question for you, Lynn. So since we are in America, do you think the U.S. has a position to help the Ukraine? Or do you think it's a good idea, or should we just let them handle it and not make it a sticky situation any more than it already is?
Well, that's a really, really complicated question. I mean, the U.S., we made some fumbles here, public fumbles. I don't know if you listened to the tape that appeared on YouTube with Victoria Nuland. But the U.S., I think, tries to support people who want to have self-determination. I don't think anybody believes that we're going to put American troops on the ground to support Ukraine, though. For me, I'm really a specialist in Poland, and throughout this whole period from 1989 to the present, the Poles were fortifying their defense, putting a great deal of money into defense spending, and creating an army that's quite formidable. For people in the Baltics, not so much. I think they didn't foresee this happening. So I think that the United States can help members of NATO by showing that we support the alliance. It's very clear that NATO is the most important strategic alliance that exists today. The UN has failed in its attempts to protect civilian life or to prevent genocide, and Bosnia was the most stark and terrible example in Europe. So I think that the United States is committed to NATO, and that's a very important thing. It's a very important strategic alliance. So I support that, and I think that we're doing the best we can in a really difficult situation.
Awesome. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for your time. We truly, truly appreciate all your insight and your information that you've shared with us today. And thank you so much for tuning in to University Television Presents. My name is Ashley Cox, and we will see you next time.